Welcome to Excel Smart. Today's tutorial is Pivot or Lookup, how to choose between the best Excel functions. Pivot tables and lookup functions do very similar things. They both summarize data in ways that hopefully will be useful. What we're going to do today is we're going to, in the context of a project, show different spots where you'll want to go with pivot tables and some situations where you'll want to use lookup functions. We're going to do this in a way that will make it easy for you to remember. Because it's a similar type of training, we will be referring back to the lookup and look rate tutorial at various points today. Without further ado, let's get ready to pivot. Creature has not been super cooperative in making this video, so let's hope we have some success here. All right, screen share is up and running. Today's project, we're going to be summarizing fantasy football data. If you're into fantasy football, hopefully that's a nice little bonus for you, but it'll apply to any data set that you might have. We're trying to line up player ranking data, so expert rankings, expert predictions on which players are going to score the most by position each week of the last 3 NFL seasons. And we're going to try and compare that to data showing how many points they actually did score. Before we get started here, I'm going to name these data sets. So this is the rankings data, and this is the scoring data. So I don't want to know if these data sets are clean. If we've taken out if there's a lot of junk in here, a lot of errors, the tool we're going to use to do that, especially because we're dealing with a data set that is, if we go down, it's only about 15,000 rows long, which in the grand scheme of things is not a super large data set. We're going to use pivot tables to quickly slice and dice our data to see if there's any data we need to exclude from our analysis. Now, in most situations where you're dealing with data sets, say, that are smaller than this, I would summarize this data, I would convert it to a table. At 15,000 rows, and the fact that we're going to be using a pivot table, in the interest of calculation speed, I'm actually going to leave this as a range, which means I'm not going to do format as table. If you want to know how to format as table, check out the Lookup and Look Great tutorial that is linked on screen. But I'm going to leave this data as a range, which means that I'm just going to leave it as data in the Excel sheet like here. A range is just a selection of cells within Excel. So now that my cursor is somewhere within this table, and I know I don't have any blank rows, I can quickly check that by taking a few of the columns here, hitting Control down arrow, and if it brings me all the way to the bottom, that means that there were no gaps on the way there. I can do that for each of these columns here. That means that when I go to insert a pivot table, Excel is going to guess, and it'll almost certainly guess correctly on what data I want to work with. I go up into the ribbon here, since my cursor is in the range, go to Insert Pivot Table. Excel prompts you for where your data table is, and you see this blinking dotted line here. It guessed correctly, so no need to change this entry for my range. So it says select table or range. We are working with a range today, and I always want to put almost always want to put my pivot tables in a new worksheet. One of the great things about pivot tables is you can quickly change the size of your pivot table depending on what you want to look at. And I don't like overwriting data, so I like to have the pivot table in a sheet by itself. So I'm going to hit OK. Now our pivot table is created. It just doesn't have any data in it. Now you see Excel has created a new sheet, sheet 1 here. The pivot table is in this area right here. If I want to start showing data in this nebulous area, what I have to start doing is dragging these fields, which are the different columns of data that I have in my range, and start dragging them into either the filters, the columns, make them column headers, make them rows, or drag them into the actual working area of the pivot table. Before I do that, notice one of these fields here is called display. Excel is taking the column headers that we have in our range. So we can see here, display is the third column header. It is what our name column is going by. So I'm going to change that to player/team name. If you're wondering where I got this data, I did get it legally. So don't worry about it.
We have a deal.
Now that I've changed the column header, I go back into the pivot table here, and I can go up to the green buttons here that have showed up on the ribbon. You see pivot table, analyze, and design. These will show up whenever you are selected within your pivot table. If you select outside the pivot table, they go away. If you're ever wondering where those are, it's because you're probably selected outside your pivot table. The field list also goes away when you click out, but if you want the field list to go away, just maybe because you don't need it in a given moment, that's actually a button in the pivot table analyze folder. So you can turn off the field list and turn it back on. But you remember what we were trying to do here, this word display, we've changed that. So I need to refresh on my data set. And I clicked refresh, it is changed to player/team name. If it were refreshing continuously, it'd probably be kind of slow. So now that the data is all named correctly, I want to make sure that I don't have any ranks in here that are numbers that don't make sense, like 0 or 5,000. And I want to make sure that I don't have, in some instances, say, multiple players being ranked number 1 for a given week. It's a lot easier cleaning it up now than after you find something strange on the result. I'm going to drag player/team name into the values quadrant. And what the pivot table has done as a result of that, it has found the number of times that really this is the number of rows in our range, 15,105. If you remember, that is about how many rows we have. We go down to row 15,106 because of the table headers. So that's the number of rows we have. You can do that with just about any field here. Pivot tables are nice because you don't have to just use counts, but we'll get into that a little bit later. If I want to see how many instances we have by position, I can split it out. Let's say I wanted to look at the different rows here. I want to have the number of QBs, the number of RBs. I take the pos, which is the position, bring it into the rows. That means it'll split it out by row based on position. So you can see here defenses, the DEF, I have 1,363 of those in the data set. I got a few more kickers here. I got some blanks, which isn't amazing. I'm going to want to remove those. But I still want to look for things like duplicates, so I'm going to keep going. Within each position, I'm going to see how many instances we have by rank. Now, I want to look at it where I have the position first and then split out the rank below it. So when I drag rank into the rows, I want to go to the bottom, which means that it will be indented as a subcategory within the position. If I flip this around and put rank above pos, then it's going to do rank first and then the number of by position within that rank. How your rows are listed out here is really the outline hierarchy of your pivot table, how it's displayed. And you can see here, there are actually a lot of zeros for defenses that I'm going to want to get rid of. I want to keep slicing and dicing here. And when I refer to slicing and dicing, I'm talking about quickly moving things around, usually in a pivot table. I want to split out by year now. Now I could take year and I could split it, put it in rows and make a really long list here, but this is actually a little bit tough. I have to scroll a long time. I mean, there are 17 weeks in the NFL season, so each rank by position should show up about 17 times, but I don't want to have to keep scrolling up and down. I might miss something. So I'm actually going to split out by year here. Instead of making it the third indentation on the outline, I'm going to split it out into columns B, C, and D. So I'm going to bring the year up here to column. And what the pivot table has done here is it has brought the year by year totals, and it has actually given me a grand total column because now I'm putting data in multiple columns. So I can more quickly see what we need to go clean up. The zeros we have to take care of, and these instances where we have ranks that are really large numbers, we don't want to include those either. Everything else being 17 or relatively close to it for the sake of our analysis is fine. I'm not super happy with one of these being a 9, but if our goal is to look for overall trends in the data, that's going to be fine. So now I know what I want to remove. I have to go back into the rankings data and remove it. You may be tempted here to delete data, but I don't like deleting data because if I change my mind later, I can't go back and undelete it very easily. Bonus tip today, I'm going to add a column here that says include. In any instance here where I have a ranking of 0 or a ranking that I want to remove from my data set, I'm going to make it 0. And for include, I'm going to make it a 1. So I'm going to do that real quickly because that's not super interesting. I'm just going to be filtering here.
A few moments later.
All right. All the different rows in the table have now been designated as either include, which is a 1, or do not include, which I'm going to use here as a 0. I want to see what my data looks after making those exclusions. So if I go back to my pivot table, what I want to do is I want to be able to filter on the ones and see how the data looks. So I have to expand my data source to include that column that I just added. So what I do here is I go up to Pivot Table Analyze, I go to Change Data Source, and I have all my data that I'm currently using selected. If I hold down the Shift key and just do right arrow, I can grab that extra column. Once I hit Enter, you can see now this include field has popped up on my data set. So what I can do here is bring that over as a filter, so it throws it up here above the table, and I can filter on include for ones. And there we go. Scoring data, we want to do some checks as well. So I'm going to do a pivot table here for our scoring data, similarly to how we did it before. I'm going to change the name of that column header to be more of what we want. There we go. I'm going to be looking for duplicates. I want to know if a player's score is counted twice in a given week. So I'm going to bring the player/team name down as the thing we're also counting for. I'm going to go by year in the rows, so that's split out by year. I'm going to have the actual week in here, and I actually want to summarize this by player/team name, so I'll put them at the top. So now AJ Brown, we can see, showed up 51 times in our data set. In no individual week did he show up more than once. I want to be able to quickly check this for everybody. So the way I can do this, one technique is to use the status bar to look for a max in this column But the problem is right now I'm looking at 22,000. That's the grand total here at the bottom. So Excel gives you grand totals when you make a pivot table. You can turn these off. That's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to go up to pivot table. I'm going to go up to design. Couldn't click there with the screen recording thing. I'm going to turn off subtotals. They do not show subtotals. And turn grand totals off for rows and columns. Now it's just the individual weeks. If I highlight this column here, we got maxes of 2. A couple players that are showing up twice in a week for scores. I gotta get rid of that. It's difficult to get rid of that when you're in the pivot table. I could Control F for each instance of 2 and then go find them in the raw data. Or we're gonna go with our first selection here where lookup functions beat out the pivot table, which is in this case using COUNTIFS to remove duplicates in a data set. So I'm going to make a column here in my data called instances, and I'm going to use a function here called COUNTIFS. COUNTIFS is part of the IFS family of functions. It's really doing what a pivot table would do. Remember how in our pivot table, we were counting, if you look in the field list, the count of player/team by all the criteria we set? COUNTIFS will do the same thing, but it'll put the answer in a cell. And because this cell is within our range, we'll be able to filter on it very easily. So we're going to build a COUNTIFS function here. So you do COUNTIFS, open parentheses. Before I gloss past it, don't use COUNTIF. That would be the same for all the other functions. SUMIFS is better than SUMIF because with the ifs, you can do one criteria or multiple. You don't lose anything by doing so. So I'm going to do COUNTIFS. I'm looking for every instance of Green Bay, for example, week 1, 2021. And then for row 2, I want that to be the number of instances of Jacksonville, week 1, 2021. The way you do that is you do each column as a criteria range. So the first one here is year. And then I set my criteria for this counter, which is the year that's already here. For criteria range 2, I'm going to column B, which is week, and look for week 1. And criteria range 3 is player/team name, and go for Green Bay. It is, again, going to look for any instance that is a hit on all 3 of these. It's not going to look for a hit of or, it's going to hit for and. All of them have to be true. So I hit enter, close parentheses, and hit enter if you'd like to be a completionist in your function typing. And there's one instance of 2021 week 1 Green Bay. If I double click this cell here or drag this formula to the bottom of the table, which takes a second, see the calculating down at the bottom, you can see our instances of 2, and I can actually filter that here. I'm going to turn our auto filter off and on, and Excel will take these filters off and now add them to this new column we've created. I can filter here to go for the 2s, which is going to take a second, but it'll show us the 2s.
12 seconds later.
While we're waiting here, I'm going to tease the next step. Sometimes Excel can take a while to make calculations. It can happen with lookup functions. It can happen with pivot tables. I'm going to show a way to deal with that. I see the instances that are duplicates. I am somewhat familiar with the fantasy football data here, so I'm just going to eyeball which ones should be removed. I know which ones to remove here, not because of anything with Excel. It's just because I understand the fantasy football data set. The instances, filter. All right, I don't want to do that again. That took too long. So I'm going to use a method here to speed up the calculation time of my spreadsheet. Technique is called the value paste, not just paste values, the value paste. The first flavor of value paste is the top shelf method. What you do here is you highlight every row except for the first one. So this row up here with this function, this is your top shelf. You're going to highlight everything else in the table and Control-Shift down arrow, copy it, and do paste values. Now if I want to apply a filter and compare it to before, it's much faster because Excel isn't recalculating. And I can do a lot of things now that I have the function just in the top shelf. I can play around with my filters. I can finish off my include data set here. But the top shelf method isn't the best for every instance. There are 2 main problems with the top shelf method. The first one is I can't really sort here because if you sort with an ifs, any of the family of ifs functions, it's going to get jumbled up. This function is going to end up in a weird spot. I don't want to do that. I'll actually demonstrate that here. So this is now in the first row. If I want to sort by player/team name, I don't know where that function just went. It might be with Green Bay here. I think it went down there, but now if I wanted to find it again, I'm not going to be able to find it. And sometimes it is surprising where this ends up depending on what kind of filters and sorts you're doing. The alternative to the top shelf method is the back pocket method. So instead of keeping it on the shelf, you're going to take this function, you're going to copy it. You can copy it with or without the equals sign. You can copy it without the equals sign and always add it later. And store it somewhere in your spreadsheet where you'll know where to find it later. My favorite spot here is to put it as a note on the column header. And you actually could put in equals in here because but I don't like copying the equals because if I were to save it, say over in the spreadsheet for some reason, it would start calculating, which isn't what I want. The reason why you would use, now that I've done that, I can get rid of the function here. The reason why you would use the back pocket method instead of the top shelf method, either to avoid the sorting problem, or if your lookup function is actually referring to another spreadsheet, you may want to break that connection, especially if you're working in a corporate environment where you may have some spreadsheets that are now on Microsoft Teams or on a shared file server somewhere. Whenever that calculation runs, it's trying to open the other file, which can take a very long time, depending on your network connection speed, how big the file is. If you want to avoid that entirely, you gotta use the back pocket method. But now our spreadsheet's gonna be super quick here. And one of the advantages, to be honest, of the ifs functions, even though they can be a little bit slow as we see, you have a way around it by using the value paste. With pivot tables, when you start getting slow, there's not much you can do. You kind of just are slow. Now I can double check here. I can go back to my data checking pivot table. I can include my include data set here. Hit enter, and I can filter out the excludes and see if I have fixed my problem. Yep, max of 1. All right. Final step here, to really actually summarize the data now that the data is nice and clean. We need to bring the data sets together. We need to look at rankings data in the same range as scoring data. So we have to combine them. There are very advanced ways to do this. You may be able to use Power Query, for example. But remember, one of the big things with Excel Smart Videos is we want to give you the methods that are not overly complex so that someone else could, say, reverse engineer what you're doing. You don't want, when you die, they bury your spreadsheets with you because no one understands it. Like those, I mean, that may happen with some of us anyway. Instead of using Power Query, what we're going to do is we're going to combine our data sets in the most effective way, which in this instance is going to be using the family of ifs functions again. Now you see here we're going back to our rankings data. We can use this rankings data table and start pulling scoring data in. Now this might take a little bit long to calculate. There's a lot we're actually removing here. So in the interest of just making our pivot table work a little faster, I'm actually going to do a filter and move on, where I'm filtering on the includes, and I'm copying this data table over to its own sheet. Kind of leave the past behind us. What I need to do for every player/team name here is I need to find the points scored in that given week, because that's going to allow us to compare this ranking and compare it to points scored. Because we know in our scoring data that each player name is only showing up once between the week and the year of interest, we could use a regular lookup function. We could use the XLOOKUP function to get our answer. But what you might be thinking is, how do you do a lookup function on multiple criteria? Well, the way you do that is with a concatenated XLOOKUP. If you remember from the Lookup and Look Great tutorial, we were looking up on a single criteria. For example, we would look for, say, Josh Allen, and the first instance of Josh Allen in our data set, it would give us a result. Well, we wanted the first instance of Josh Allen week 1, 2022, or the only instance of that. The way you do that with XLOOKUP is first you have to prime your data to be indexed that way. That means going to your scoring data to your data source and adding a column that is the concatenation of all the fields you want. A lot of people will call this the lookup column because it's a unique identifier for lookup functions to go find. Create a new column called lookup and do equals, say, year and ampersand week 1, or whatever's in the week column, ampersand player team name. Those are the 3 columns that define this row as being unique. So that's what I want to look for. I want to make sure the duplicates are truly being removed. So I'm going to add this include button as 1. So there's only one instance of each of these in my data set. The way I can look this up now, and going back to sheet 4, which is we'll call this the combined data set so we don't get lost, is I can do an XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP will take first the value we're looking up, and this is the concatenation. What you do here is you have to match exactly where you want to look in the scoring data. You'll notice here this week 1 here, this is actually a bit of a problem because we have week 0, 1 in every other instance. So I've actually realized that I have some cleaning to do. How you want to clean this up, you can do sneaky bind and replaces with Control F until you get all the right data, or you can just filter and change it one by one. What I'm going to do is the method that you can do as someone creating a tutorial video, and snap your fingers and it'll work. Oh, there you go. All right. For points scored here, my concatenated XLOOKUP is going to take a lookup value. Remember, this has to be in the same order as what is in your data set, which is the year, then the week, then the player, then the include signifier. So I'm going to go year, ampersand, week, ampersand player/team name, ampersand. Now I want to add a 1 to the end here, so I'm just doing in double quotes a 1, and that's the lookup value. The lookup array, we're going to try to find that in the lookup column, and upon a hit, you bring points in, which is in column D of our data set. So you can see you get the score here. One thing that's nice about XLOOKUP is if you found an error, which you can see by looking at the filter here, there are some errors. You can say if you didn't find it, it's a 0. But everything we just did, not to waste your time or anything, there's another way we can do this that, in my opinion, is even more effective. And it's using the SUMIFS method. We can use SUMIFS to get the score in, and we know we're not going to get any duplicates because we have one instance of the data in our raw data table. So we're going to do points scored here. I'll show you how that works. Points scored, SUMIFS. The reason why this is a nice method is because you don't need to create a concatenated lookup function. You don't need to do error handling. If it doesn't find any instances where all 3 criteria are met, it's going to give you a 0. And the SUMIFS function is designed to work on multiple columns to begin with, so you don't have to smash 3 columns into 1 like you did with the XLOOKUP. So we're going to do for SUMIFS here. Actually, I have to type the function SUMIFS. That would be helpful. The sum range, move this over here, is the points column. First criteria is year, so that's criteria range 1 is the year. Right to combine data, I'm going to grab the year for this row. Then the week. Let's go back and get the week. And then the player/team name. No error handling, no extra helper column creation. But because we know we have one instance of every combination in our raw data set, we can use the SUMIFS function to get the scores. And we leave both of these in here just for fun. And now it's time to analyze the data. How do we do that? Well, we go to insert here. We're going to go back to pivot tables because we want to get some quick observations to see what we're dealing with. So now we're within this range. We go into insert again. We're going to create a pivot table, and we're going to make a bit of a plot here. What we're going to take is the different ranks and the actual points scored. Now you notice here it did a sum here for points scored by different ranks, and actually we can take position across the top. We don't really want a sum here. What we want to do here is go down to values here. It's taking a sum, and it sometimes guesses assuming you want to add it all together. But there are other options here. We can go to sum here and go to value field settings, and we go to average. Now it's taking the average score by rank, by position, over our data set. Grand total isn't overly useful, so I'm going to try and sneak my cursor in here without stopping the recording. I'm going to turn off grand totals. Probably won't need subtotals either. Also, I don't need all these decimals, so I'm going to highlight these columns and flip on over to number, which allows me to draw the decimals down. And I can see the ranks here. And I can actually, now that I have this nice pivot table, I can quickly insert a chart. I'm going to do a line chart. And you can see, we actually, there's a bit of a relation here, at least with the average score you get by position and the rank. So you have ranks across the bottom and the positions here. Now I am even closer now to drawing some conclusions. I can maybe, make a trend line on what the average is. I can do a lot here. But there's one more thing we want to consider doing. So let's say I wanted to look at, and I could take position here instead of columns. I can make it a filter and just look at one position at a time. There's a spot where pivot tables may fall short for summarizing data. Imagine I wanted to compare the average quarterback score, for whatever reason, against the average for all positions. And I want that to be the only 2 lines on the chart. If I added a totals value here, if I added that back, you see I can't get grand totals because I'm just looking at one at a time. Remember what I said before though, lookups and pivot tables are really doing the same thing. I can create my own table, so this is the pivot. This is a lookup summary. What I can take here is I can take against a bunch of ranks, and I can actually take a table that looks very similar to what I dealt with before. So let's say I want to take the ranks and I want to take them down to 20. Maybe I can declare my position up here in cell A1, and then this is going to be average points scored for the position. And here I can make average points scored for all positions. So just these column widths. I'm going to do an average ifs function, and a lot of these ifs functions to choose from, and do exactly what the pivot table would do. So if you need to create these custom charts here, so I go into the combined data, I'm taking the average of the points scored. The criteria is column for rank is over here. I can do the rank. And for position, I want to declare what I have up here. I'm going to use absolute cell references, which is another thing that was referred to back in the Lookup and Look Great. Allows you to drag your functions around without breaking them. What we have for average ifs, I'm always in column G for the total, so I want to make those absolute references by adding $signs. Now, whatever this function is, if I copy and paste it, it'll still look in column G. Same for column B. We're looking for which rank. On this sheet, column A has my rankings. The row can change as I drag the function down. I want to refer to ranks, different ranks as I move, so I want to put an absolute sign, so a $sign in front of column A, but I don't want to put it in front of the row two. And lastly, if I'm looking for a position, I can absolute column E, and I always want to go back to this top cell, so I'm putting absolutes for both cell A and cell 1. I can, if you don't want to type $signs, the F4 key lets you toggle between them. See, like I'm flipping around there. I'm going to hit enter, and after formatting this the way I want, drag this down, and I have the average score by quarterback for the different ranks. And if I want to compare this to average score for all positions, I can actually drag this over. Because I want to look for all positions, I can simply remove this lookup or this final criteria against position. So just delete that. And that's looking at the average points scored for all positions, because it's not asking to be specific by position. It's just taking the average score by rank. And now take this same thing, add an actual line chart. I don't need my rank to be a part of the line chart. It took that because I put QB right there in the column there, so I can just delete that. And if I change this value now to whatever position I want, I can make that comparison that you couldn't quite make in the pivot table. And that's the end of today's tutorial. I am thankful that it looks like the screen recording actually worked on me this time. If you want to get really good at Excel, subscribe to Excel Smart. I've been using Excel at an advanced level for about 20 years. I'm going to be putting everything I've learned on this channel. So if you found today's tutorial useful, I'll see you in the next one.